There is a moment nobody warns you about when you become wealthy. It isn't when you see your first million in your account. It isn't when you buy the house you couldn't afford before. It's when you're sitting across from the people who knew you before the money, and suddenly you're afraid to tell them good news. Because somewhere between the first dollar and the first million, something changes. Not always in them, sometimes in you. And the worst part? Nobody has to do anything wrong for the friendship to start falling apart. It began with a dinner that should have meant nothing. 5 friends, 1 small table. The same restaurant they'd been going to for years. Before the business, before the investments, before anyone had enough money to feel comfortable. The waiter dropped a check in the middle of the table. For years, the routine had been automatic. Someone pulled out a calculator. Someone complained about the tax. Someone said, "Why did we order dessert?" They laughed. That night, you'd reach for the bill without thinking. "I've got it." Silence. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but you felt it. Mike looked up. Someone smiled and said, "You sure?" "Yeah." "Okay." The conversation continued, but something had changed. You couldn't explain what, and that's what made it uncomfortable, because nobody had asked you to pay. Nobody accused you of showing off. Nobody looked angry. They simply looked aware. And for the first time, you realize money doesn't always enter a friendship through an argument. Sometimes it enters through silence. A few years earlier, none of this would have mattered. You and Mike used to sit in parking lots after work eating cheap food and complaining about their bosses. They both had empty savings accounts. Both had credit card balances. Both joked about becoming rich one day without having the slightest idea how. Then you started a small business. It wasn't glamorous. You worked from your kitchen. You answered messages late at night. You celebrated your first profitable month like you'd won the lottery. Mike knew everything. The failed ideas, the unpaid invoice, the client who disappeared. He was the person you called when you wanted to quit. And when the business finally started working, he was genuinely happy for you. That's important, because at the beginning, there was nothing to be jealous of. There was no gap. Your success didn't threaten his identity. It was just a good thing happening to his friend. Then the numbers got bigger, and the relationship became more complicated. The first major breakthrough wasn't $1 million. It was enough to breathe. Enough that you stopped checking your bank account before buying groceries. Enough that an emergency didn't automatically become a crisis. You told the group. Mike smiled. "Man, that's huge." You laughed. "I still feel broke." He said, "Good, stay broke in your head." You both laughed. But later that night, you replayed the conversation. Why had you told them? Why did you suddenly feel like you needed to explain that you hadn't changed? That question stayed with you. And then came the requests. "Do you know anything about investing? Should I start a business? Can you look at this deal?" Then one evening, a friend asked for money. It wasn't a huge amount for you. It could have been a huge amount for him. You sent it immediately. No speech, no conditions. 3 weeks later, the money came back, exactly when he said it would. And with it came a message. "Thanks. I wanted to make sure you knew I'm not depending on you." That sentence bothered you. Not because it was insulting, because it told you he'd already started thinking about what money meant between you. Then your lifestyle changed. Not dramatically. That was the strange part. You weren't buying gold-plated cars, you weren't posting private jets. You simply stopped making every decision based on price. A better apartment, a reliable car, a trip you'd always wanted to take. Things that felt normal to you now started looking different to everyone else. So you began hiding them. You'd wear the older jacket around certain friends. You wouldn't mention the trip. You'd avoid talking about the business. You told yourself you were being considerate, but there was another reason. You didn't want anyone to feel behind. And that sounds generous until you realize what it does to you. You start editing your own life, not because someone demanded it, because you were afraid of what your success might do to the room. Then one night, Mike noticed. "You don't tell us anything anymore." You smiled. "What are you talking about?" "You used to tell us everything." "I've just been busy." He nodded. "Yeah, maybe." That maybe stayed with you, because he was right. The breaking point came at a group dinner. You offered to pay. Everyone accepted. You thought you were removing pressure. Instead, someone laughed and said, "Must be nice." It sounded like a joke, but it wasn't entirely a joke. You smiled. Yeah, I'm lucky. The table went quiet. You looked around. Nobody knew what to say next. And suddenly you understood something painful. Generosity can create distance when the person receiving it doesn't feel equal anymore. You weren't trying to make anyone feel small, but your money had made the difference visible. For the rest of the evening, you talked about old memories, school, bad jobs, embarrassing stories, anything except money. On the drive home, you thought, how did something I wanted for years become something I have to apologize for? Then came the friend who refused your help. He was struggling. You knew it. You offered privately. Let me take care of it. No. You don't have to pay me back. I said no. You're making this harder than it needs to be. He looked at you. No. You're making it easier than it is. You didn't understand. Then he said, I don't want to owe you. You're my friend. I know. Then let me help. He shook his head. Because you're my friend, I don't want money to become the reason we're friends. That stopped you. You had spent years thinking money gave you the power to solve problems. That night, you learned something different. Sometimes helping someone means respecting the problem they need to solve themselves. You went home angry, then embarrassed, then grateful, because he had protected something you hadn't realized was becoming fragile. After that, the group slowly divided. No dramatic argument, no betrayal, just fewer messages, fewer invitations. Plans happened without you. Sometimes you found out afterward. When you asked why, the answers were always reasonable. Thought you were busy. Figured you'd be traveling. Didn't think you'd be into that place. Each explanation made sense. Together, they formed something that didn't. Distance. You kept reaching out. You organized dinners. You suggested weekends. You tried to recreate the old group. But every attempt felt like rebuilding a house after everyone had moved away. And then came the realization you had been avoiding. You weren't trying to save the friendship. You were trying to save the version of yourself that existed before the money. And that version was gone. The strangest night happened after your biggest financial milestone. You had finally reached the level of wealth you dreamed about for years. You could buy almost anything you wanted. You could leave any job. You could solve almost any practical problem with money. You had freedom, but you sat alone in your house with your phone in your hand, and you couldn't think of anyone to call. That was the moment you understood the real cost. Money had made your life bigger, but the bigger your life became, the smaller your circle became. You could buy privacy. You could buy convenience. You could buy time. But you couldn't buy a conversation that felt exactly like the ones you had before anyone cared about your net worth. And that hurt more than you expected. So you called Mike. No plan, no speech. Just, can we talk? He said, yeah. You met in person. For a while, neither of you mentioned money. Then you finally said, why did we stop being close? Mike looked down. I don't know. You do. He stayed quiet. Then he said, sometimes I look at you and feel like I'm failing. You didn't expect that. I never wanted you to feel that way. I know. Then why did you pull away? Because every time something good happened to you, I was happy for you. He paused. And then I went home and compared my life to yours. You didn't know what to say, so you told him the truth too. You said you'd started hiding your life because you were afraid your success would make him uncomfortable. He laughed. See, that's the problem. What? Now you're protecting me from your life. For the first time in years, you both laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was true. The friendship hadn't been destroyed by money. It had been buried under everything neither of you was willing to say. After that night, something changed. Not back to the way it was. Something better. You stopped pretending you were financially equal.
He stopped pretending your success didn't affect him. You stopped hiding. He stopped comparing. You still didn't lend money automatically. You didn't pay every bill. You didn't force him into your lifestyle. And he didn't need to prove that he could keep up. Instead, you found things money couldn't purchase. Long walks, old jokes, late-night conversations, showing up, being honest. The friendship became smaller in some ways, but deeper. And eventually, you understood something you didn't understand when you first got rich. Not everyone is supposed to come with you. Some people belong to a chapter. Some belong to the whole book. And the few people will stay, not because your lives remain identical, but because they care more about who you are than the distance between your bank accounts. That's the real lesson. Becoming wealthy doesn't automatically reveal fake friends. It reveals pressure. It reveals insecurity. It reveals comparison. It reveals whether you can celebrate someone's success without measuring your own life against it. And it reveals whether the successful person can remain humble without shrinking themselves to make everyone else comfortable. So when your life changes, don't hide your success, but don't use it as proof that you're better either. Don't buy loyalty. Don't make generosity a substitute for friendship. And don't force people to celebrate a version of your life they haven't learned how to understand yet. Give them space. Give them honesty. Give them dignity. Because one day, you might discover something more valuable than becoming wealthy. You might discover that the people worth keeping aren't the ones who never feel the distance. They're the ones who feel it and still choose to cross it. And maybe that's what becoming rich was really supposed to teach you. Not how much you can afford to leave behind, but who you're willing to walk back for.